You belong to a party that is providing us with a government that has as its environment department, DEFRA, a kind of department for getting rid of the rural vote. I'm okay. Good news is you're not a minister in the government. What's going on?
Well, you know how to start with the easy questions, don't you? I think in recent history, we've got to acknowledge that we do have a problem. My constituency is entirely rural. It's 335 square miles of North Buckinghamshire. And I think there's two ways of looking at it. On some of the headline things that are in politics at the moment, the cost of living, inflation, that hits rural communities harder than it hits urban communities. Because if the cost of petrol and diesel is high, well, those of us that live in the countryside know that we have to travel further to go to the shops, to drop the kids to school, to get to work, all of those things. And so some of the macro stuff that is affecting everyone is hitting rural communities harder than urban ones. But equally, when it comes to the rural way of life, we've dropped, and I say we as in my colleagues who are ministers, I'll be blunt and honest about it, dropped a number of balls, the most recent one being the GL43 issue that isn't helping build trust with rural communities. It's an absurdity that we found ourselves in that place. It's an absurdity that we haven't fixed it already. The clock is, let's be honest, we're now looking at next year, fixing it for next year, past the point of no return for this season.
I should say GL43, for anybody who doesn't know, is the general license that has been canned, that you now may no longer release game birds within 500 metres of a European designated special protection area, which has an effect on hundreds of shoots around the countryside. And we've had a gamekeeper on this morning who's likely to lose his job, and we'll have other gamekeepers in the same position. But Greg, one of the great things about you is you've been standing on College Green in front of our cameras, just telling us how ridiculous the situation is and how you've been able to represent our view. Because I do feel one of our problems is we're obviously not getting the arguments across.
Look, I shoot myself, so that I've got some skin in the game, if you like. I'm passionate about standing up for shoots the length and breadth of the country. I've spoken in Parliament on the various grouse-moor debates that, let's face it, those that are opposed to grouse shooting generally force upon Parliament. I've done stuff with your channel, with other channels as well. It's trying to get government to understand, and by government I mean the civil service infrastructure that sits underneath ministers, that advises ministers. Because it's quite clear in the example of the GL43s that civil servants put together something in conjunction with Natural England, a plan, a flawed plan, a plan that the science didn't stack up, bounced it in front of a minister that isn't even really sitting on top of this area, whilst Richard Benyon, who was on holiday. And then we find ourselves some months down the line from that with a massive, great problem. And my personal reaction, I've had a lot of conversation with Richard Benyon, with Therese Coffey, the Secretary of State, with the Chief Whip. The Chief Whip has a pretty good pedigree from this world with the Countryside Alliance.
Simon Hart, he used to be head of the Countryside Alliance.
Yet we still haven't managed to fix it at the moment. I think you had Geoffrey Clifton Brown on stage.
Well, he's your biggest
yesterday.
fan.
Absolutely, he's a great man. You. Well, I'm a huge fan of his as well. Let's make it. Yeah.
Well, actually, he did say, though, strangely enough, he said it's not the civil service. I would never blame the civil service. I'm getting a real sense of inside track from you here, because our reading of it is that it is the civil servants, and I would go further and say, is it because they all want a nice, comfortable job in the RSPB later on in their lives? Is there a sort of revolving door going on here?
I don't know if there's a revolving door.
Okay, I'm sorry, I'm asking you to accuse them of corruption, but
look, I think there is a mindset, and I see this across multiple things, not just in the field of shooting, hunting, fishing, etc. But I've got 19 miles of this horrendous thing called HS2 being built through the middle of my constituency. If you want to see real environmental destruction, have a look at that railway that we can't afford. And too often, it's because those that are advising don't understand the territory, don't understand the issue, don't understand the geography, the impacts, etc. Because we do have a very urban-centric, metropolitan view of the world in the way that ministers are advised. You know, I can't be certain of this, but I would put a small wager on the civil servants and those that are advising ministers on this issue to almost certainly live in a city, probably have never lived in the countryside, have certainly never shot, have certainly never done the things that we all know actually exist out there and are a reality. And I think we need far more rural proofing of government full stop, whether that's looking at, you know, some of the net zero debate around oil-fired boilers, whether it's looking at field sports, whether it's looking at planning in rural communities. We need far more people who understand rural to be at the heart of government, not just as MPs and as ministers, but civil servants and advisors as well.
Anybody prepared to take that bet? No, I didn't think so. No, I mean, this is what it looks like, you know, and whether it is or not. I mean, one thing that really struck us about this was not so much the decision, which was totally illogical, about GL43 and depended on a view of bird flu from last year that's not relevant now, but the fact they did not consult. They didn't talk to Basque or any of us about the decision they were about to make when birds had already hatched, and they're consigning those birds to the grinder, I imagine, in their own minds.
You're spot on. I can't argue with that point. Yeah, we as politicians, those of us, you know, like Geoffrey Clifton-Brown, me, and Jonathan Ginogli, who I think is here today, who sit on the all-party group for shooting and conservation, we found out about it by accident. And, you know, and that is just an absurd position to be in. And of course, you know, we got to arms pretty quickly. We got the relevant ministers round the table. We started those conversations. I think the error was that because that consultation hadn't happened, you hadn't got the view from the real world, if I can put it that way, that hadn't already naturally fed up through our constituents, through shoots in our own constituency to us, or, you know, in some cases directly to us, because, you know, lots of us do shoot as well, that we had this failure. I can't beat about the bush on that. It has been a failure. We still haven't fixed it for some reason. You know, my personal view is we should have looked back to what Michael Gove did when we had a similar mess a few years ago, just brought the whole thing in-house, issue all the licenses, and then should have said to Natural England, I won't get drawn on what I think should happen to Natural England, well, but then told to Natural England, right, now you monitor these. Because we know what would have actually happened. Avian flu would not have been spread. But to give Natural England, you know, puff out their chests a little bit and say, right, you monitor these licenses now. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and we're in this total mess where it's too late for this season for those shoots, and we've got to fix it for next year.
Right, you mentioned countryside, you mentioned the urban mindset. One thing that some people are saying to me is that the 2024 election might be characterised more in rural constituencies like yours as being more country versus urban than right versus left. Is that a characterisation you recognise, or will it still be? You also mentioned the really key petrol prices question, yeah, social services question, that is at the heart of why people choose governments. But is it possible we're going to see countryside versus urban take over from right versus left? Is that a direction of travel?
I don't know as whether it will come down as clearly as that. I still think most people still have a view of the world that is either leaning to the left or leaning to the right when it comes to their back pocket, when it comes to social issues, when it comes to things like the National Health Service. However, I think that, going back to what I said earlier, rural communities have felt the pressure of the pandemic much more harshly than many of their urban counterparts, certainly rural business support, etc. The fuel crisis, since both in terms of household energy and the cost of petrol and diesel since the invasion of Ukraine, has hit rural voters hard. If you just look at off-gas grid properties and declare an interest, I'm off-gas grid where I live, there just wasn't the same support given to those that needed to fill an oil tank or LPG tanks or LPG canisters. And there wasn't even, to go back to my point earlier, there wasn't even that understanding in what was the business and energy department at the time, that there was even a price differential between oil and LPG. And there wasn't even an understanding that some people have LPG tanks and some people have the 47 kilogram cylinders. And the cost of those 47 kilogram cylinders are pretty punitive at the best of times and went through the roof. Yet government just saw all off-grid as one uniform
They tend to see it
thing.
as a big green blob that occurs outside the M25. I agree with you. That's a problem. I've got Therese Coffey here tomorrow, I hope. She's coming in just after lunch. If you were sitting in my chair, what would you ask her, especially with the fact there is a 2024 election likely? What would you ask her?
Look, I speak to Therese all the time. She's a colleague. She's Secretary of State for DEFRA. And I think what ministers need to hear is the strength of feeling from rural communities and from specific rural interests. There needs to be that palpable sense of anger that there has been over GL 43. There needs to be that palpable sense of anger that rural communities feel, to use that oil burning boiler example again, at being told that even though other technology exists, there are far better ways. You can, for a couple of £100 have your boiler converted to run on HVO. There is still this looming ban that says from 2026, sorry, you're going to have a heat pump that probably won't work.
And wood burners don't look good
They
either.
need to hear that. They hear it from me. They hear it from lots of other backbench MP colleagues, but real people out there in all the constituencies need to ensure that ministers are hearing that message, because otherwise the Whitehall-centric advice mechanism that we talked about earlier will probably win.
Can we pretend you're not just MP for Buckingham, you're MP for the whole countryside, and ask the audience to throw questions as their pretend representative in Parliament? Is that all right?
Okay, let's do that.
Here we go. I'll hold on to the microphone so I can't get them to lecture you. Hi.
The question I've got, the DEFRA, is it really fit for purpose?
Look, lots of government departments have been tinkered with to try and make them more fit for purpose in the last year. We've had the big change from what was BASed and DCMS to have this new Science, Innovation and Technology Department and Energy and Net Zero Department, DESNES as it's become known. And actually my challenge in that as a backbencher is sometimes when you tinker with the edges of departments, you end up splitting responsibilities, creating an even more siloed government. And when you look at something like the net zero debate and the development of synthetic fuels, for example, which just work in existing internal combustion engines across the piece, be they cars or planes or ships or combine harvesters, you then get too many departments responsible. So I think whilst DEFRA certainly needs some reform, I wouldn't want to see it split up, because that will create too many silos in government. What we need within DEFRA are probably some much stronger guiding principles of what they are in fact for, because DEFRA has spent far too long in recent years firefighting individual issues, be it the sewage issue, be it the transition from the Common Agricultural Policy to ELMS. Actually, DEFRA just needs a greater defining purpose, that it is for the countryside, it is for the rural way of life, it is for farming, rather than the way that it has reacted to many things over recent years as, oh, we've got a bit of a crisis here or a bit of a problem over there, we just need to draw a circle around that very specific thing and find a solution to it.
It's failed at the Ivory Act. It's banned the word ivory. It hasn't banned ivory. It failed to bring in the Kept Animals Bill. It's failed to produce an Animal Sentence Act that's done more than make DEFRA the third revising chamber for the Houses of Parliament. And it's about to fail, by the look of it, with the Trophy Imports Act. Isn't it time to replace it with something? What could you replace it with?
I mean, on one level, I'm quite glad they've failed on most of those things. So let's not. Let's be careful what we wish for in that. The Kept Animals Bill was a Christmas tree bill that, frankly, could have had all sorts of dangerous things hung off it, so the government were quite right to pull it, in my mind. Animal sentience, I very much played bad cop to Geoffrey Clifton Brown's good cop in the debates on that my amendments were even more, I suppose, to the antis extreme than what Geoffrey put forward in his amendment in order to drive the government in the direction of accepting Geoffrey's amendment. So actually, sometimes use the power of Parliament to stop bad legislation. Trophy hunting is of course a private member's bill. rather than a government bill. Although it has government support, and there's still time for it to die in the House of Lords. But the general question of what do you replace DEFRA with, I suspect the instinctive government position would be to separate out a department for agriculture to a department for water, for general environment and so on. And actually, I think if you do separate those things out, you're going to end up with the very mess and the additional silos that I spoke about earlier. So my view is that it just needs a much better defining purpose of what it is for, and then people like me from the backbenches of the House of Commons can hold ministers to account as to whether they're delivering on what it is actually for.